The morning air was cold and sharp outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists lined the black iron gates, cameras ready, waiting for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood an elderly woman in a worn purple coat. Her name was Margaret. She was 78 years old. She had traveled alone from a small village 2 hours away. This was her first time in London in over 40 years. Margaret clutched a folded photograph in her gloved hand. The edges were soft from being touched too many times. In the picture, a young soldier in uniform stood tall and proud. Her late husband. He had served as a royal guard in this very place, decades ago. She had promised herself that one day she would return. Today was that day. She stood near the crosswalk just beyond the palace gates. Her eyes were locked on the guards in their red tunics and bearskin hats. She remembered how her husband used to describe the weight of that uniform, the pride he felt, the discipline it took to stand perfectly still, no matter what happened around him. Behind her, the city buzzed with life. Buses rumbled past. Taxis honked. Street vendors called out to customers. But Margaret heard none of it. She was lost in memory. One of the guards on duty that morning was a man named Daniel. He was 29 years old. He had been serving for 7 years. Standing at his post, rifle in hand, Daniel was trained to remain motionless, to ignore distractions, to focus only on his duty. But something made him glance to his left. That's when he saw her. Margaret had stepped off the curb. She was moving slowly into the street, her eyes still fixed on the palace. She wasn't paying attention to the road. She didn't hear the roar of the engine behind her. A delivery truck was speeding down the road. The driver was checking his phone. He didn't see the red light. He didn't see the crosswalk. And he didn't see the elderly woman stepping into his path. Daniel's heart slammed in his chest. Time seemed to stretch. He knew the rules. He knew he wasn't supposed to break formation. But in that split second, none of it mattered. He dropped his rifle. The tourist gasped. Cameras turned toward him. Someone screamed. Daniel sprinted toward Margaret. His boots pounded the pavement. His breath came fast and sharp. The truck was only meters away now. The driver finally looked up. His eyes went wide. He slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The truck wasn't going to stop in time. Margaret turned her head. She saw the massive vehicle bearing down on her. Her body froze. The photograph slipped from her hand and fluttered to the ground. Daniel reached her just as the truck's horn blared. He threw his arms around her and pulled her back with all his strength. They tumbled together onto the sidewalk. The truck screeched past them, so close that the wind from it whipped Daniel's hat off his head. It skidded to a stop 30 feet down the road. For a moment, everything was silent. Margaret lay on the cold pavement, gasping for breath. Daniel knelt beside her, his hands shaking. His heart was racing so fast he thought it might burst. Around them, the crowd erupted. People were shouting. Some were crying. Others had their phones out, filming everything, but Daniel didn't hear any of it. He was staring at Margaret, making sure she was okay. Her eyes met his. They were wide with shock. Tears began to roll down her wrinkled cheeks. "You saved me," she whispered. Daniel nodded, still catching his breath. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head slowly. "No. I don't think so." Police officer rushed over. Paramedics arrived within minutes. The crowd pressed closer, everyone wanting to see what had happened. The truck driver stumbled out of his vehicle, pale and shaking, apologizing over and over. But Margaret wasn't looking at any of them. She was looking at Daniel, and she was remembering her husband. The same uniform, the same courage. Before you go, if you're loving this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss. Another emotional moment like this one, Daniel helped her to her feet. She was trembling, but she refused to let the paramedics take her away just yet. She bent down slowly and picked up the photograph from the street. It was dirty now, but still intact. She held it out to Daniel. "This was my husband," she said quietly. "He was a guard here, just like you." Daniel took the photo carefully. He looked at the young man in the picture. Then he looked back at Margaret And in that moment, he understood why she had been standing there, why she hadn't been paying attention, why this place meant so much to her. But what he didn't know yet was that this moment would change both of their lives forever. Within an hour, the video was everywhere. A tourist had captured the entire moment on her phone. Daniel sprinting from his post. Margaret frozen in the street. The truck barreling toward her. The desperate rescue. The photograph falling to the ground. The video was uploaded to social media with a simple caption: "Royal Guard breaks protocol to save woman's life." It went viral instantly. Millions of views, thousands of comments. News outlets picked it up. By that evening, Daniel's face was on screens across the country. Reporters camped outside the palace gates asking questions. Who was he? Who was the woman? What would happen to him now? Because breaking protocol was serious. Very serious. Daniel sat in a small office inside the palace. His commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, stood across from him with his arms crossed. The older man's face was stern, unreadable. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. "You abandoned your post," Harrison said finally. His voice was calm, but firm. "You dropped your weapon. You broke formation in front of hundreds of witnesses." Daniel sat up straight. His jaw was tight. "Yes, sir. I did." "Do you understand the consequences of that?" "I do, sir." Harrison studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed and sat down. "Tell me what you were thinking." Daniel hesitated. "I wasn't thinking, sir. I saw her. I saw the truck. And I knew if I didn't move, she was going to die." "You're a soldier, Daniel. You follow orders. You maintain discipline. That's what we do." "I know, sir." But Daniel paused. He chose his words carefully. "If I had stayed at my post and she had died, I don't think I could have lived with that." Harrison leaned back in his chair. He didn't respond right away. Outside, the sound of cameras clicking and reporters shouting drifted through the window. "You've put me in a difficult position," Harrison said quietly. "The rules exist for a reason. If every guard broke protocol whenever they felt like it, there would be chaos. But," he paused, "you also saved a woman's life, and the whole world saw it." Daniel said nothing. He waited. "There will be an inquiry," Harrison continued. "The higher-ups will decide what happens next. Until then, you're suspended from active duty." Daniel's heart sank, but he nodded. "I understand, sir." However, Harrison stood up and walked to the door. He turned back. "For what it's worth, I would have done the same thing." Daniel looked up, surprised. Harrison gave a small nod. Dismissed. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in her small flat 2 hours away. She had refused to go to the hospital. The paramedics had checked her over at the scene and said she was fine. Just shaken. But she wasn't fine. Not really. She kept replaying the moment in her mind. The truck. The sound of the horn. Daniel's arms pulling her back. The way he had looked at her afterward, it's like he genuinely cared if she was okay. Her neighbor, a woman named Susan, sat beside her on the sofa. Susan had driven to London as soon as she heard what happened. She held Margaret's hand. "You could have died," Susan said softly. "I know," Margaret whispered. "What were you thinking, stepping into the street like that?" Margaret looked down at the photograph in her lap. "I wasn't thinking. I was just remembering." Susan squeezed her hand. "He would be proud of you for going back there. But he wouldn't want you to get hurt." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "That young man? He risked everything for me. He didn't even know me. And now he might lose his job because of it." "You don't know that. I saw the news." "They're saying he broke the rules. They're saying there will be consequences." Margaret's voice cracked. "He saved my life, Susan. And now he might be punished for it." Susan didn't know what to say. She just held her friend's hand and let her cry. That night, neither Daniel nor Margaret could sleep. Daniel lay in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and family. Some were supportive. Some were worried. His younger brother had sent a text that simply said, "You're a hero, mate." But Daniel didn't feel like a hero. He felt uncertain. He had spent 7 years building his career, 7 years of discipline and dedication, and now it could all be over. Margaret sat by her window, looking out at the dark countryside. The photograph of her husband rested on the table beside her. She thought about the day he had come home from the palace for the last time, how proud he had been, how he had told her that serving his country was the greatest honor of his life. She thought about Daniel, about the fear in his eyes when he realized what was about to happen, about the way he hadn't hesitated, about the way he had held her afterward, making sure she was okay. She made a decision. The next morning, Margaret picked up her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed the number for Buckingham Palace. It took her 3 tries to get through to someone who would listen. "My name is Margaret Ellis," she said firmly. "I'm the woman who was saved by one of your guards yesterday, and I need to speak to whoever is in charge of his case." The person on the other end hesitated. "Ma'am, I don't know if please," Margaret interrupted. Her voice was steady now, strong. "That young man saved my life, and if he's going to be punished for it, then someone needs to hear what I have to say." There was a pause. Then the voice said, "Hold the line, please." Margaret waited. Her heart pounded. She didn't know if this would change anything, but she had to try, because Daniel had given her a second chance at life. And now she was going to fight to give him a second chance too. 3 days later, Margaret sat in a formal meeting room inside Buckingham Palace. The walls were lined with portraits of former guards and military leaders. A long wooden table stretched between her and 3 officials. Colonel Harrison was there. So was a senior advisor to the royal household and a representative from the Ministry of Defense. Margaret wore her best dress. Her hands were folded in her lap. She had practiced what she wanted to say 100 times. But now, sitting across from these serious faces, her nerves threatened to overwhelm her. "Mrs. Ellis," the advisor began. Her voice was polite, but businesslike. "We appreciate you coming in today. We understand you wanted to make a statement regarding the incident." "Yes," Margaret said quietly. She cleared her throat. "Yes, I did. Please, go ahead." Margaret took a breath. "I want to start by saying that what happened was my fault, not his. I wasn't paying attention. I stepped into the street without looking. If Daniel hadn't acted, I would be dead right now." The officials exchanged glances, but said nothing. "I know he broke your rules," Margaret continued. Her voice grew stronger. "I know he left his post. I know that's not what he was supposed to do. But if he hadn't, I wouldn't be here. My children wouldn't have a mother. My grandchildren wouldn't have a grandmother. That young man gave me a second chance at life. And if you punish him for that," she paused, her eyes glistening, "then what kind of message does that send?" The room was silent. Colonel Harrison looked down at the table. The advisor leaned back in her chair, considering. "Mrs. Ellis," the ministry representative said carefully, "we understand your gratitude. But the military operates on discipline, on structure. If every soldier made decisions based on emotion in the moment, the system would collapse." "With respect," Margaret replied, her voice firm now, "I'm not talking about every soldier. I'm talking about one man who saw another human being in danger and chose to help. Isn't that what soldiers are supposed to do? Protect people?" The advisor nodded slowly. "You make a fair point. My husband was a guard here," Margaret added. 40 years ago. He used to tell me that the uniform meant something. It meant honor. It meant courage. It meant standing up for what's right." She looked directly at Colonel Harrison. "That's what Daniel did. He stood up for what was right, and I think my husband would have been proud of him." Harrison met her gaze. Something softened in his expression. The senior advisor stood up. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellis. We'll take your statement into consideration. The inquiry is still ongoing, but your words will be part of the record." Margaret nodded. She had said what she came to say. As she stood to leave, Colonel Harrison walked her to the door. "Your husband," he said quietly. "What was his name?" "Thomas Ellis." Harrison smiled faintly. "I've seen his name in the old records. He served with distinction." "He did." "He would be proud of you too," Harrison said. for coming here today." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Thank you." While Margaret was fighting for Daniel, the rest of the world was watching. The video had been shared millions of times. News channels replayed it constantly. People were calling Daniel a hero. Petitions were started online demanding that he be honored instead of punished. But not everyone agreed. Some military experts argued that discipline had to come first, that allowing guards to break protocols set a dangerous precedent. The debate raged on television, on social media, in newspapers. Daniel tried to ignore it all. He stayed in his apartment, away from the cameras and reporters. His friends urged him to give interviews to tell his side of the story, but he refused. "I didn't do it for attention," he told his best friend Marcus over the phone. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. That's all." "I know, mate," Marcus said. "But people want to hear from you. They want to know you're okay." "I'm fine. Are you, though?" Daniel didn't answer right away. The truth was, he wasn't fine. He was scared. Scared of losing everything he had worked for. Scared of letting down his family. Scared that his one moment of instinct would define the rest of his life. "I don't know," he admitted finally. On the 5th day after the incident, Daniel received a phone call. It was from Colonel Harrison. "Report to the palace tomorrow at 900 hours, Harrison said. "The inquiry has reached a conclusion." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Yes, sir." And Daniel, "Yes, sir. Whatever happens, you acted with courage. Remember that." The line went dead. That night, Daniel couldn't eat. He couldn't focus. He paced his apartment, replaying every decision he'd made that day. Should he have stayed at his post? Should he have called for help instead? Could he have done something differently? But then he remembered Margaret's face, the terror in her eyes, the way she had whispered, "You saved me." And he knew no matter what happened tomorrow, he had made the right choice. Margaret couldn't sleep either. She sat in her living room, the television on but muted. The news was still covering the story. They showed clips of Daniel in his uniform, clips of the truck, clips of the rescue. Susan had stayed with her for the past few days. She sat beside Margaret now, knitting quietly. "Do you think they'll let him keep his job?" Susan asked. "I don't know," Margaret said. "I hope so. I pray so. You did everything you could. I hope it was enough." Susan reached over and squeezed her hand. "Whatever happens, you spoke the truth. That matters." Margaret nodded, but the worry didn't leave her face. The next morning, Daniel put on his uniform. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing. He didn't know what to expect. Honor or dismissal, praise or punishment. He took a deep breath and headed out the door. At the same time, Margaret was getting ready to leave for London. She didn't know if she'd be allowed to attend the inquiry, but she wanted to be there. She wanted Daniel to know that she was supporting him no matter what. Susan drove her to the train station. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "I have to be there," Margaret said. "He was there for me when it mattered. I need to be there for him." The train ride felt impossibly long. Margaret stared out the window, watching the countryside blur past. She thought about her husband. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the strange way life connected people, even across generations. When she arrived at the palace, there was already a crowd gathered. Reporters, supporters, people holding signs that said, "Daniel is a hero," and "Courage over protocol." Margaret made her way through the crowd, her heart pounding. She didn't know if she'd be allowed inside, but she had come this far. She wasn't turning back now. Inside, Daniel stood in the same meeting room where Margaret had given her statement. The same officials sat across from him: Colonel Harrison, the advisor, the ministry representative, and in the corner of the room, to his surprise, sat Margaret. Their eyes met. She gave him a small, encouraging nod. Daniel felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He wasn't alone. The advisor cleared her throat. "Lance Corporal Daniel Carter, we have reviewed the events of November 4th. We have considered the circumstances, the testimonies, and the public response. We have reached a decision. Daniel stood at attention. His heart hammered in his chest. Your actions that day were in direct violation of protocol, she continued. However, she paused. Daniel held his breath. However, the advisor repeated, we also recognize that your actions saved a life. You demonstrated courage, quick thinking, and selflessness. These are qualities we value highly in our servicemen and women. He didn't dare move. After careful consideration, and taking into account the testimony of Mrs. Margaret Ellis, we have decided that no disciplinary action will be taken against you. The words hung in the air for a moment. Daniel felt his knees weaken with relief. Across the room, Margaret covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. Furthermore, the advisor continued, you will be reinstated to active duty immediately. Your conduct, while unconventional, exemplified the core values of service and protection. The Queen herself has been made aware of this incident, and she wishes to commend you personally. Daniel's breath caught. The Queen? Colonel Harrison stood up, a slight smile on his face. You'll be invited to a private ceremony next week. It's not every day a guardsman becomes a national hero, Carter. Daniel wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He managed a simple, thank you, sir. Dismissed, Harrison said. But as Daniel turned to leave, the colonel added, and Carter? Well done, Daniel nodded, still processing everything. As he walked toward the door, Margaret stood up. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then she crossed the room and embraced him. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for everything. Daniel hugged her back, his throat tight with emotion. I should be thanking you. What you said? What you did for me. You gave me my life back, Margaret said, pulling away to look at him. It was the least I could do. Outside the palace, the crowd had grown even larger. When Daniel and Margaret emerged together, a cheer erupted. Cameras flashed. People shouted his name. Reporters rushed forward with microphones. Daniel was overwhelmed. He had never wanted this kind of attention. But Margaret took his arm and squeezed it gently. They're proud of you, she said. Let them see the man who saved me. Daniel took a breath and faced the cameras. A reporter thrust a microphone toward him. Lance Corporal Carter, how do you feel right now? Daniel paused. Grateful, he said simply. Grateful that Mrs. Ellis is safe. Grateful that I was in the right place at the right time. And grateful to be able to continue serving.
Ow.
Do you regret breaking protocol? No, Daniel said without hesitation. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Another cheer went up from the crowd. Margaret smiled beside him, her eyes shining with pride. Over the next few days, Daniel's life changed completely. He returned to his post at the palace, but now tourists would recognize him. They'd point and wave. Some would call out, "You're the hero." Children would ask for photos. It was strange and overwhelming, but also humbling. Margaret returned to her village, but she and Daniel stayed in touch. They exchanged phone numbers before she left London. She would call him every few days just to check in, to see how he was doing, to tell him stories about her husband and what life at the palace had been like 40 years ago. Daniel found himself looking forward to those calls. Margaret reminded him why he had joined the Guard in the first place. Not for glory or recognition, but to serve, to protect, to make a difference. One evening, about 2 weeks after the incident, Daniel's phone rang. It was Margaret. "Hello, Mrs. Ellis," he said warmly. "Daniel, dear, I have something to tell you." Her voice sounded excited. "I've been invited to the ceremony. The one where you'll meet the Queen. They want me to be there." Daniel smiled. "That's wonderful. I'm glad you'll be there." There's more, Margaret continued. "They want me to present you with something. A special commendation. From the families of veterans who served at the palace." Daniel was speechless for a moment. "Mrs. Ellis, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept it," she said softly. "My Thomas would have wanted you to have it." Daniel felt tears prick his eyes. "I'd be honored." The day of the ceremony arrived. Daniel wore his formal dress uniform, every button polished to perfection. His family had traveled from across the country to be there. His mother couldn't stop crying. His father kept clapping him on the shoulder. Unable to find the right words, Margaret arrived with Susan, She wore an elegant navy dress and carried a small wooden box. When she saw Daniel, she walked straight to him and took his hands. "Are you ready?" she asked. Daniel said, "Are you? I've never been more ready for anything in my life." They were led into a grand hall inside the palace. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Portraits of kings and queens lined the walls. At the far end of the room, a small stage had been set up. The queen entered, and everyone stood. She was smaller than Daniel had imagined, but her presence filled the room. She moved with grace and dignity, acknowledging people with small nods as she made her way to the stage. Daniel's heart pounded as he was called forward. He walked to the center of the room, his steps measured and precise. The queen stood before him, her eyes warm and kind. "Lance Corporal Carter," she said, her voice clear and strong, "your actions on the 4th of November demonstrated extraordinary courage and humanity. You put the life of another before your own safety and reputation. This is the highest form of service." She pinned a medal to his chest. The room applauded. Daniel saluted, his hand steady, despite the emotions swirling inside him. Then Margaret was called forward. She carried the wooden box carefully. When she reached the stage, the queen stepped aside, allowing Margaret to speak. "On behalf of the families of all who have served as royal guards," Margaret began, her voice shaking slightly, "I present you with this." She opened the box. Inside was a silver pocket watch, engraved with the words, "For courage, honor, and compassion." "This watch belonged to my husband," Margaret said, looking at Daniel. "He wore it every day of his service, and I want you to have it, because you represent everything he believed in." Daniel took the watch with trembling hands. He looked at Margaret, then at the watch, then back at her. "Mrs. Ellis, I can't." "You can," she said firmly, "and you will. Promise me you'll carry it with you. Let it remind you that what you did mattered, that you made a difference." Daniel nodded, unable to speak. He pulled Margaret into a gentle embrace, and the room erupted in applause once more. After the ceremony, there was a small reception. Daniel's family met Margaret. They thanked her over and over. Daniel's mother hugged her and whispered, "You saved my son too. You saved his career, his future." Margaret just smiled. "He saved my life. It was only fair." As the evening wound down, Daniel and Margaret stood together near a window, looking out at the palace grounds. The sun was setting, casting everything in golden light. "Do you ever think about that day?" Daniel asked quietly. "Every day," Margaret admitted, "but not with fear anymore. With gratitude." "Me too." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Margaret turned to him. "You know, my Thomas used to say that life puts you exactly where you need to be when you need to be there. I never fully believed him until now." Ow. Daniel smiled. "Maybe he was right. He usually was," Margaret said with a soft laugh. But neither of them knew that this was only the beginning of their story, that their connection would grow deeper than either could imagine, and that the ripple effect of that one moment would touch more lives than they could ever predict. In the months that followed, Daniel and Margaret's friendship deepened in ways neither had expected. What started as phone calls once a week became calls every few days, then daily conversations. They talked about everything: life, loss, hope, dreams they'd given up on, and dreams they still held close. Margaret would tell Daniel stories about Thomas, how they'd met at a dance hall in 1965, how he'd been too shy to ask her to dance, so she'd asked him instead, how they'd built a life together on love and patience and small moments of joy. Daniel would tell Margaret about his fears, about feeling like he didn't measure up, about the pressure of being called a hero when all he'd done was what anyone should do, about wondering if he'd made the right choice joining the military. "You did," Margaret would always say. "Look at all the good you've done. Look at the life you saved." "I saved one person," Daniel would reply. "That one person is someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone who still has stories to tell and love to give." Never underestimate the value of one life, Daniel. Those words stayed with him. One Saturday afternoon in late spring, Daniel drove out to Margaret's village. He'd been meaning to visit for weeks, but duty kept him in London. Finally, he had a weekend off. Margaret's cottage was small but charming. Roses climbed up the front wall. A wooden gate creaked as he pushed it open. Before he could knock, the door swung wide, and Margaret stood there, beaming. "You're here," she exclaimed, pulling him into a hug. "I told you I'd come." "I know, but seeing you is different than hearing your voice." She led him inside. The cottage smelled like fresh bread and tea. Photos covered every surface. Daniel recognized Thomas in many of them, young and proud in his uniform. They sat in her small living room, drinking tea and eating biscuits she'd baked that morning. Margaret showed him more photos. Her children. Her grandchildren. Her life. "They wanted to be here today," she said, gesturing to a photo of 3 grown adults with their families. "But I told them I wanted it to just be us." "I hope that's all right," of course Daniel said. "I'm honored you wanted to see me." "Daniel, you're not just someone who saved my life. You've become like family to me." Daniel felt warmth spread through his chest. He'd felt the same way, but hadn't known how to say it. "You're family to me too, Mrs. Ellis." "It's Margaret," she corrected gently. "Please." "Just Margaret." "Margaret," he repeated with a smile. Later, she took him to the small cemetery on the edge of the village. Thomas's grave was under a large oak tree. The headstone was simple but well kept. Fresh flowers sat in a vase at its base. Margaret knelt down slowly, her hand resting on the stone. "Hello, my love," she said softly. "I brought someone to meet you." Daniel stood respectfully back, but Margaret gestured for him to come closer. "Thomas, this is Daniel. He's the young man I told you about, the one who saved me." She looked up at Daniel, tears in her eyes, but a smile on her face. "I think you would have liked him very much." Daniel knelt beside her. He didn't know what to say, so he just placed his hand next to hers on the stone. They stayed there for a long time. In silence, as the wind rustled through the oak leaves above them, as summer turned to autumn, Daniel noticed something changing in Margaret. She seemed tired more often. She'd pause mid-sentence, forgetting what she was saying. During their phone calls, she'd sometimes ask him the same question twice. He tried not to worry. She was 78 after all. But something in his gut told him something wasn't right. One October evening, his phone rang. It wasn't Margaret. It was Susan. "It's Daniel. It's Margaret," Susan said, her voice strained. "She's in the hospital." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What happened?" "She collapsed this morning. They're running tests, but—" Susan's voice broke. "They think it might be her heart." Daniel didn't hesitate. "I'm coming. I'll be there as soon as I can." He called his commanding officer, explained the situation, and was given emergency leave. Within 2 hours, he was on the road to Margaret's village. He arrived at the hospital just after midnight. Susan met him in the waiting room. Her eyes were red from crying. "How is she?" Daniel asked. "Stable for now." "But Daniel?" Susan took his hand. "They said her heart is very weak. They don't know how much time she has." Daniel felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "Can I see her?" "She's been asking for you." Margaret's room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. She looked so small in the hospital bed, so fragile. When she saw Daniel, her face lit up with a weak smile. "You came," she whispered. Daniel pulled a chair close and took her hand. "Of course I came. Did you really think I wouldn't?" "I didn't want to be a burden." "You could never be a burden, Margaret." She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "I'm scared, Daniel." He felt tears burn in his eyes, but he kept his voice steady. "I know, but you're not alone." "I'm right here. Promise me something," she said. "Anything. Promise me you'll keep living. Keep being the good man you are. Keep making a difference. Don't let losing me make you stop caring." Daniel's tears fell freely now. "I promise. But you're going to be okay. You're strong. You're a fighter." Margaret smiled sadly. "I've had a good life, Daniel. I've loved and been loved. I've raised children and watched them grow. And in my last years, I got to meet you. That's more than most people get. Don't talk like that, please." "I'm not giving up," she said gently. I'm just prepared for whatever comes. Daniel stayed with her through the night. He held her hand. He told her stories about the palace, about the tourists who still recognized him, about the children who called him a hero. He told her about his dreams of maybe becoming a teacher someday, of helping young people find their path. Margaret listened, her eyes closed, but a smile on her lips. You'd be a wonderful teacher, she murmured. As dawn broke through the hospital window, Margaret fell asleep. Daniel stayed beside her, watching her chest rise and fall with each breath, praying for more time. Over the next 3 days, Margaret's condition stabilized. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. She'd need surgery, but there was a chance. A real chance? Daniel refused to leave. He took leave from work. He slept in the uncomfortable hospital chair. He was there when the doctors came with updates. He was there when Margaret's children arrived, her grandchildren. He became part of the family vigil. On the 4th day, Margaret was wheeled into surgery. Her children gathered in the waiting room. Daniel sat with them, his hands clasped, his head bowed. She talks about you all the time, Margaret's daughter Claire said to him. She says you gave her a reason to keep going. She gave me a reason too, Daniel replied quietly. The surgery took 6 hours. Every minute felt like an eternity. Daniel paced, prayed. He remembered every moment he'd shared with Margaret. The phone calls, the visits, the way she'd fought for him when he needed it most. Finally, a surgeon emerged. Everyone stood up at once. The surgery went well, the doctor said, and the room collectively exhaled. She's stable. It'll be a long recovery, but she's strong. Stronger than we expected. Daniel closed his eyes and sent up a silent thank you to whoever might be listening. When Margaret woke up hours later, groggy from anesthesia, the first thing she saw was Daniel sitting beside her bed. You're still here? She said, her voice hoarse. Where else would I be? You should be at work. At the palace can wait. You can't. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve you. You deserve everything good in this world, Daniel said, taking her hand. And I'm going to make sure you get it. As Margaret slowly recovered over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. The media, which had moved on to other stories long ago, picked up the thread again. They ran updates. Hero Guard stands by the woman he saved. Photos of Daniel at the hospital went viral. People were touched by the depth of their bond. But Daniel didn't care about any of that. All that mattered was that Margaret was getting better. That she was going to have more time, more days, more moments. One afternoon, as Margaret sat up in bed eating soup, she looked at Daniel thoughtfully. You know what I've been thinking about? She said, What's that? That day, when you saved me? I've been thinking it wasn't just about you saving my life. It was about you giving me a reason to live it. Daniel tilted his head, not quite understanding. I was sad that day, Margaret explained. Lost in the past. I wasn't really looking forward anymore. I was just existing. But then you came into my life. And suddenly, I had something to live for again. Someone to care about. Someone who cared about me. I do care about you, Daniel said softly. More than you know, I know, Margaret said, reaching for his hand. And that's the gift, Daniel. Not just the saving. The caring. The staying. That's what really saved me. Margaret came home from the hospital 6 weeks later. Her children wanted her to move in with one of them, but she insisted on returning to her cottage. I've lived here for 40 years, she told them firmly. I'm not leaving now. But she wasn't alone. Daniel made sure of that. He arranged his schedule so he could visit every other weekend. On the weekends he couldn't come. He'd arrange for someone else to check on her. Her neighbors. Her friends. Even some of his fellow guards who lived nearby. A support network formed around Margaret. And at the center of it was Daniel. One crisp November morning. Almost exactly 1 year after the incident, Daniel knocked on Margaret's door. She opened it with a bright smile, looking healthier than she had in months. Happy anniversary, she said with a twinkle in her eye. Daniel laughed. Is that what we're calling it? 1 year since you saved my life. I'd say that's worth celebrating. She'd prepared a special lunch. They ate together in her small dining room, talking and laughing like they'd known each other for decades, not just a year. After lunch, Margaret pulled out an old photo album. "There's something I want to show you," she said. She opened to a page near the beginning. There was a photo of Thomas, young and handsome, standing at his post at Buckingham Palace. But in the background, blurry but visible, was a woman in a purple coat. "That's me," Margaret said softly, pointing to the figure. "The first day I came to see him at work. I was so proud of him I couldn't stay away." Daniel looked closer. "You've always loved that place." "Have." It represented everything good about Thomas. His dedication. His honor. His courage. She turned to look at Daniel. "Just like it does with you." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "I don't know about that." "I do," Margaret said firmly. "Thomas would have been proud to serve alongside you, and I'm proud to know you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the past year settling between them. So much had changed. So much had been gained. "Daniel," Margaret said eventually, "there's something I need to tell you. I've made a decision." He looked at her, concerned by the serious tone in her voice. "My children and I have talked about it, and we've decided to create a scholarship in Thomas's name. For young people who want to serve in the military but can't afford it." Daniel's eyes widened. "Margaret, that's incredible. And we want you to help run it. To be part of this selection process, to mentor the recipients." She took his hand. "You understand what it means to serve with honor, what it means to put others first? We need someone like you involved." Daniel was speechless. Tears welled in his eyes. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Margaret said with a smile. "Say you'll help us honor Thomas and help others at the same time." "Yes," Daniel managed. "Yes, of course. I'd be honored." Margaret pulled him into a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means everything to me." Over the next few months, the Thomas Ellis Memorial Scholarship was established. The story spread. Donations poured in. People who had seen the video of Daniel saving Margaret wanted to contribute. Veterans groups got involved. The scholarship grew beyond anything Margaret had imagined. The first recipient was a young woman named Sophie, 18 years old. From a small town in Wales, she'd dreamed of joining the military her entire life, but couldn't afford the costs. When she received the scholarship, she cried tears of joy. Daniel and Margaret met her together. They told her Thomas's story. They told her their story. And they told her that she was now part of something bigger than herself. "Make us proud," Margaret said, hugging Sophie tightly. "I will," Sophie promised. "I won't let you down." As Daniel watched Margaret with Sophie, he realized something profound. That day a year ago, when he'd run into the street, he hadn't just saved one life. He'd started a chain reaction. Margaret had fought for him. He'd stayed by her side. Together, they'd created something that would help countless others. One life saved had multiplied into many lives changed. 2 years after the incident, Daniel made a decision of his own. He was offered a promotion that would have kept him at the palace for another 5 years. It was everything he'd worked toward. But when he sat down to really think about it, he realized his heart was pulling him in a different direction. He called Margaret to tell her. "I'm leaving the Guard," he said. There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure?" "I am. I want to teach. I want to work with young people. Help them find their path like you and Thomas helped me find mine." Margaret's voice was warm with emotion. "I think that's wonderful, Daniel. Your students will be lucky to have you." "I wouldn't have had the courage to do it without you," he admitted. "You taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help one person at a time, even if it's not flashy or heroic. Even if no one's watching? Your husband used to say that?" "No," Margaret laughed. "But he should have." Daniel completed his training and began teaching at a secondary school in London. He taught history and led a mentorship program for at-risk youth. He told his students about duty and honor, but also about compassion and humanity, about the importance of being there for others. And once a month, he'd bring his students to visit Margaret. She'd tell them stories about Thomas, about history, about the value of service. The students loved her. They called her Gran, and she beamed every time. On a warm day in June, 3 years after the incident, Margaret's cottage was full of people. Her family, Daniel. The scholarship recipients, students from Daniel's school. The small house overflowed with life and laughter. It was Margaret's 81st birthday, and Daniel had helped organize a surprise party. When Margaret walked into her living room and saw everyone gathered there, she gasped and pressed her hands to her chest. "Oh my goodness," she breathed. "What is all this?" "Happy birthday, Margaret," everyone chorused. She looked around at all the faces, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her children, her grandchildren, the young people whose lives she'd touched through the scholarship. Daniel, standing at the center of it all, with a cake lit with candles. "Make a wish, Gran," one of the children called out. Margaret closed her eyes. She thought about Thomas, about that day 3 years ago when she'd almost lost everything, about Daniel running toward her, risking everything to save her, about all the beautiful moments that had come after. She opened her eyes and looked at Daniel. "I don't need to wish for anything," she said softly. "I have everything I need right here." She blew out the candles, and the room erupted in cheers. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Daniel and Margaret sat together in her garden. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Do you ever think about that day?" Margaret asked. It was the same question Daniel had asked her years ago. "Every day," Daniel replied. "It changed my life." "Mine too," Margaret said. She reached over and took his hand. "You know, when I woke up that morning 3 years ago, I felt like my life was over, like I'd lived all my good days already. I went to the palace to say goodbye to a memory, and instead, I found a future. I found you. I found purpose again. I found out that life isn't over until it's over, and sometimes the best chapters come when you least expect them." Daniel squeezed her hand. "I found the same thing. I thought being a hero meant doing something big and dramatic. But you taught me that real heroism is showing up, day after day. For the people who need you, we saved each other," Margaret said simply. "We did." They sat in silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house behind them, laughter rang out. Young voices, old voices, all mixed together in the messy, beautiful chaos of life. "Thank you, Daniel," Margaret said quietly, "for running toward me that day instead of away, for staying when you could have left, for making an old woman feel like she still mattered." "You more than matter," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You changed me. You've changed so many people. That scholarship has helped dozens of young people now, and it all started because I was in the right place at the right time." "No," Margaret corrected gently. "It started because you were the right person, in any place, at any time." Daniel looked at her, this remarkable woman who had become family to him, who had fought for him, who had shown him what real courage looked like. Not the kind that happened in one dramatic moment, but the kind that showed up every single day. "I love you, Margaret," he said simply. "I hope you know that." "I do," she said, squeezing his hand. "And I love you too." Like the grandson I never had. As the last light faded from the sky, they stayed there together. A royal guard and an elderly woman. A hero and the life he saved. A family forged not by blood, but by circumstance and choice, and the kind of love that says, "I see you, I value you, and I will be here." Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories start with a single moment of choice, a decision to run toward danger instead of away, to care about a stranger, to show up when it matters most. And sometimes those moments ripple outward in ways no one can predict, touching lives and changing futures and proving that heroism isn't about the uniform you wear or the medals on your chest. It's about the choice to be there when someone needs you, to stay when others would leave, to love when it would be easier not to. That was the real story. Not of a dramatic rescue captured on camera, but of two people who found each other in a moment of crisis and chose, day after day, to keep choosing each other. That was the story that would be told for generations. In Margaret's family, in Daniel's classroom, through the scholarship that bore Thomas's name and carried forward their shared values, one moment, one choice, one life saved, and from that, a legacy of love, courage, and compassion that would echo forward long after both of them were gone. That night, as Daniel drove home through the quiet streets, he looked at the pocket watch Margaret had given him, the one that had belonged to Thomas. He ran his thumb over the engraving, for courage, honor, and compassion. And he smiled, knowing that somewhere Thomas was smiling too, proud of his wife for her strength, proud of Daniel for his heart, proud of what they'd built together from one impossible moment, because that's what heroes do. They don't just save lives, they change them. They inspire others to be better, to do better, to show up with everything they have and give it freely. And in doing so, they prove that sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the biggest ripples of hope. Asterisk.